In 1984, Arthur Scargill passionately spoke to 140,000 miners to fight for their jobs, communities and livelihoods.
We're going into the 18th week of a strike. We've come too far for anything other than to win a victory.
Coal was the black gold which kept the country going. Coal miners were the working class heroes with the capacity to either bring down the government or fuel the engine of the economy. After descending a coal mine in Wigan, George Orwell was left in awe at the job of a coal miner and noted how much of civilization depended on coal. A few decades ago that was very true, but today the British coal industry has all but collapsed. When England won the World Cup back in 1966, coal provided more than half of all the country's energy needs. Today it is less than 1%. Coal was king, but now it's been dethroned by gas, solar and wind. But what can we learn from the decline of the coal industry? Was it inevitable? And was Mrs. Thatcher right after all to close all the mines down? In the mid-1920s, over 1 million people were employed in the coal industry. Whole towns and communities were focused on the coal pit. It led to a working class solidarity and community unrivalled, perhaps for the friendship forged in the army. The work was hard, dirty and dangerous, but perhaps because of this, it forged a strong community and civic pride. Brass bands, rugby teams and a political movement were all forged in the common identity of the coal mining industry. And when the coal mines began to close, whole communities were ripped apart, leading to unemployment, loss of purpose and social decay. The economist Joseph Schumpeter claimed an essential part of capitalism was something known as creative destruction, which meant inefficient old industries had to close down to enable workers and capital to move to the new, more efficient industries. This is all very well to write in your ivory academic tower, but for those communities affected by coal mine closing, the impact was devastating. A few jobs in Lidl, Deliveroo or a warehouse can never replace the strength of purpose from 400 miners working in close proximity. One of the worst economic legacies of the 1980s was a significant rise in unemployment to over 3 million. It was precipitated by the industrial decline of the early part of the decade. It reached 3 million but took many years to come down. It left former coal towns with persistently higher unemployment, a lack of opportunity, and a rise in social problems such as drug use. It's hard to attract investment when the biggest employer leaves town. But was there ever an alternative to closing down the mines? Even if we put aside for a moment the environmental costs of coal, there is a ruthless capitalist incentive to switch to other forms of energy, especially renewables. The cost of solar energy has plummeted 90% in 10 years and is continuing to fall even today. By contrast, the cost of coal has remained stagnant. People might claim that solar and wind are too unreliable to replace fossil fuels. For example, you can burn coal in the middle of winter on a windless day. Now that might have been true a few years ago, but rapid improvement in battery storage technology mean that argument is losing relevance. There's simply no logic to subsidise fossil fuel and avoid the fact that renewables are becoming much more economic. Deep red states in America like Utah and Texas are building solar and wind not because of some woke ideology, but because the marginal cost of renewable energy is so much cheaper than maintaining coal mines. And this gap is only set to grow in the coming years. But we shouldn't ignore the environmental costs of coal, because the decline of the coal industry had a very meaningful impact on reducing the UK's CO2 emissions. Peaking in the 1970s, the closure of coal mines led to a dramatic drop in UK CO2 emissions. For a time, the UK was a global leader in reducing CO2 emissions, showing it is possible to reduce emissions without compromising economic growth. Coal doesn't just produce CO2, but also includes a variety of other pollutants, such as soot, sulfur and nitrous oxide, which are responsible for respiratory problems and higher cancer rates. Reducing coal consumption has improved the nation's health and saved lives. It is an invisible benefit of reducing coal production, a benefit often lost in the argument about fossil fuels. Now, some may argue that the UK just replaced domestic production with imports of coal from places like Argentina. And for a few years this was true, but now even imports have fallen. Last week saw the last ever delivery of coal by train to the Ratcliffe Soar Power Station. Coal is on the way out. And although it took 2 decades, UK unemployment is now much lower. In the 19th century, the Luddites smashed machines, fearing for their jobs. But the days of making clothes by hand were over. You can't hold back technological change. In 1960, still over 500,000 people worked in the coal industry. Is it such a bad thing that today it is only 600? Should the government subsidise an industry forever to protect jobs? The UK currently struggles to fill jobs in fruit picking and care workers. Would a school leaver really aspire to the dangerous job of working down a mine? And coal is one of the most dangerous industries in the economy. With miners at risk of fatal accidents, it is still 1,000 times more dangerous than producing energy from solar. Is this loss of dangerous jobs something to be mourned? A better question to ask is not should the UK coal industry be permanently kept going, but how do you manage the transition? The coal industry was particularly tricky because of how a whole town became dependent on one industry. When a coal mine closed, it affected everybody in that town because everybody was affected in some way. The miners' strike of 1984 was doubly tragic for those involved. If the economy needs to transition from coal to other energy sources, then those who lose out from the transition need to be amply compensated. It's not enough to say overall the economy benefits, because if the economy does really benefit, then the potential losers should share in the gains. At least they should have been better protected from the dramatic changes which hit so hard in the short term. At the end of the day, there was no real logic to keep 140,000 miners permanently in work like Arthur Scargill wanted. But the government could have used, say, the oil tax bonanza of the early 80s to fund new employment and training in these towns which were about to suffer so much. It's hard to look beyond your immediate job, but mining communities would have been better served by a miners' union which also recognised a future beyond coal needed to be developed. Mrs. Thatcher allowed the coal mines to be closed. It's a kind of job you are glad that somebody else did. It's hard to be the one who ends centuries of tradition, prosperity and community. But at the same time, it would have been a mistake to have permanently propped up an industry which is losing out to other sources of energy. If you're interested in the 1980s, which is a fascinating period, this video looks at all the other economic impacts of Thatcher.